Thank you very much, and thank you also for the interest you are showing by participating. I have to make a confession first, and that confession is that this is one of the speeches I never wanted to give. Because my normal comment when people were saying they are working on democratic deficit is don't waste your lifetime, because in Europe there is also a lot which could rather be described as democratic surplus, because the idea of democratic deficit immediately creates the impression that somehow we are lagging behind national parliaments and therefore we have to catch up and we are not yet fully developed. I think there is a lot of argument, and I would like to start with this without avoiding the topic. There's a lot of argument why we can say that democracy in Europe also has elements which are further developed, or at least delivering more space of freedom for parliamentarians than on the national level. To start with, if we have a look at the national systems, then it's very often the case that the space of maneuver of parliaments is limited by their own executives. Because if parliaments were to not any longer support what the government wants, the government has to resign, the parliament is dissolved, and that's the end of the story. Equally, we experience in the European Parliament that the individual member has much more space to take his own decisions and to take his own responsibility and to follow his own conscience, because the discipline which is executed on him from central level, might it be overall parliament or might it be his own parliamentary group, is much lower than it is on national level. The third argument why I think there are elements of democratic surplus is that we can say that in the European Union, in the European Parliament, it is still content and the content argument that decides. So you're not automatically wrong because you're in the minority or because you're not in government. Everything has to be decided on the basis who is providing the better argument on the individual legislative case. And the fourth point, and this goes along with the first three arguments, is that in fact democratic decision-making in the European Union is permanent negotiation. So we have a permanent negotiation between the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, and there is no prejudged outcome dependent on who is it coming from or that this is what a government wants. So these are degrees of freedom in the process which you do not find on national level, and which is why I would argue that this is democratic surplus, which is why when I had researchers in the past who were working on democratic deficit, I always said, why wouldn't you like to be the first researcher to work on democratic surplus? Much better than to be the 1000th researcher who is doing his thesis on democratic deficit. Equally, we can say that with the Lisbon Treaty we made a lot of progress. We now clearly have a two-chamber system in the European Union, with the Council representing the member states and the Parliament representing the citizens. The clarification on the Council side, very important, by singling out Madam Ashton into the European External Action Service and the European Council with its non-legislative functions as well. We have the final words on international agreement, which we have been using. Just a few passenger name record was, for example, one. SWIFT was another one. So we have been using those new powers. We are electing the President of the Commission, and something which is not yet fully understood, we can initiate treaty change. Here I would like to stop with my democratic surplus agenda, because otherwise I miss the issue and the question which is raised to me today. And of course I've accepted this because there is some background. So why do we again have a debate on democratic deficit? The first reason is because the nature of the decisions taken at the European Union level have changed with the economic crisis. And that's what I normally call, we now have a new business model in the European Union. What is this new business model? I would say the old business model was a lot of decisions which in cumulation had a big effect, of course, on people's life, But every individual decision was not perceived by the citizens as touching the core of their living conditions. That has changed with the crisis, because decisions which are now coming from the European Union, once they're hitting the ground, and not only in Portugal, in Greece and in Ireland, but also in those countries which had to give those guarantees, are perceived as impacting the core of the economic and social living conditions. Whether it's the request for pensions reform, for social security reform, whether it's the difficulties in the economy which are perceived, and those decisions are linked to Europe in the broader sense. But if that is the case, then also the degree of legitimation of the system needs to change. If I'm no longer touching the conditions of individual citizens on the margin, but if I'm giving to the heart of the economic and social living conditions, then I need a different degree of legitimation of the system. The second element is that besides the Lisbon Union, which came into force 1st of December 2009, a number of consecutive decisions of heads and states and government in the rescue operations have established, besides the Lisbon Union, we could say a second union which could be called the Rescue Union. And the Rescue Union is organized according to different principles. The Rescue Union is basically organized intergovernmentally. So you have the ESM, for example. You have all the troika actions. You have the supervision. All of this is basically happening intergovernmentally. So besides the Lisbon Union, where we are very happy with the democratic progress having been achieved, surely for reasons of necessity, but nevertheless, a kind of second union has been established, which I call the Rescue Union, which is not fulfilling the same democratic criteria and therefore is raising issues of democratic legitimacy. And the third element is that the European Council, now having become an institution since the 1st of December 2009, has not resisted the temptation, from time to time at least, to try to pre-decide on legislation. That's surely the case on the budget. We had the experience in the 2011 budget procedure where the European Council decided on the increase of the budget until two figures after the comma. So that exactly had to be fulfilled. But the budget is legislation, so to be determined and negotiated not with the European Council, but the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. So the attempt by the European Council to fix the outcome in advance until the second number after the comma is clearly limiting the possibilities of the legislature. We are now perceiving something very similar in the ongoing MFF negotiations, where a huge part of the agreement of the European Council in February is not only on figures, but in fact tries to predetermine the outcome of legislative procedures between Parliament and the Council of Ministers, which has to be based on the legislative procedure, so qualified majority. That means we are getting through the back door the reintroduction of anonymity via the European Council in the area of European legislation. So what is the problem beyond, let's say, our institutional considerations of this? I would argue that this is producing a triple problem. The first problem is a problem of expertise, because the preparation of European Council decisions is very different to the community method in legislation. The community method in legislation, you have years and years of reflection, of consultation with NGOs, with the two committees, with citizens, and you change the text and reflect and turn it around and rewrite it 100 times before it's actually being presented and finally becoming the law. Proposals which go to the European Council, at least during a long stretch of the crisis, very often came ad hoc from certain governments, not being available to all the governments, not being available to their national parliaments according to their national procedures. So the degree of expertise that went into those proposals was considerably lower than the degree of expertise you are getting with the normal community procedure. If you have problems with expertise, you produce also problems of efficiency. Because very often, briefly afterwards, you find out that what you've just decided on the highest levels, you can't implement. This is something ministers of finance are very much aware of, because the outcomes of the European Council very often, already when they were presented to the finance ministers, led to some astonishment and questions how on earth this could be implemented. And thirdly, it's also leading to very serious problems of legitimacy, because those decisions coming out of the European Council are perceived as decisions on states by other states. And why should some states decide on core issues for other states? So the perception has become quite widespread that in fact it's some states via the European Council ruling on other states, aggravated by the fact that sometimes the day after the decision was taken, you wouldn't find anybody anymore who was ready to take responsibility. The latest example of this was the first decision on Cyprus, which was taken on Sunday, where on Monday evening it was very difficult to find anybody who had participated in the process who was ready to take responsibility for the decision taken. Within 24 hours, you couldn't find anybody anymore defending the outcome, but a decision that had major consequences for an EU member country. So, how to react to this? The traditional answer, or I could also say non-answer, is treaty change. It is sure that in the next legislature, treaty change will be on the agenda, already for the reason that 5 years after the fiscal compact came into force, it should be integrated into the treaties. And also, of course, dependent within government, we might have a request of the United Kingdom to look at treaty change. But we all know that treaty change is difficult, it's time-consuming, so we surely know that this is years ahead in the future. So the question is, what can we do today? Do we have to wait for that miraculous treaty change several years in the future, or is there something we can start doing today? To put it in other words, what is the unused potential under the Lisbon Treaty? Have we really exploited all the potential under the Lisbon Treaty, or is there unused potential? That's a debate which lawyers, which I'm not, in Germany normally put under the heading of Verfassungswirklichkeit. So one thing is the constitution or the constitutional order, but the other thing is, what is Verfassungswirklichkeit? What is the concrete reality? What is the concrete practice? And I believe that for the practice under the Lisbon Treaty, there is still enormous potential which still could be exploited, and I would like to name a few. So, unused potential number one, the election of the Commission President. Why is this important? It is important because if you are participating in a national election, you are of course voting your national parliament, but you are thinking of the government. You're thinking about which executive am I going to get. You're thinking about Merkel or Steinbrück. You see this as a chance to change the direction of politics, and Parliament is a means to arrive there. That's maybe a disappointing realization when you're speaking as coming from a parliament, but it's the truth. What has happened up to now was that people were asked to participate in European Parliament elections to vote the European Parliament. But what would be the effects on the executive, in our case the European Commission, or on policy proposals remain completely unclear. That would only be unveiled after the event. What is changing with the Lisbon Treaty, and it's relevant because the Lisbon Treaty only came into force on the 1st of December 2009, so after the last election cycle, is massive. The first thing is, under the Lisbon Treaty, and this wasn't the wording before, the European Parliament elects the Commission President. So it's the European Parliament that elects. It's the European Council that proposes. But it's not just proposing, it has to propose in view of the outcome of the European elections. That's completely new. So that means the European Council is not completely free. It has to interpret or make sense of the outcome of the European elections. That's something else than what we were having up today. This is complemented by a declaration which only I know, and some who have to suffer from my speeches from time to time. That's declaration number 11. So who knows declaration number 11? Yeah. Christian is suffering from my speeches, I know. So nobody knows declaration number 11. You don't have to be worried because they asked our legal service, they didn't know declaration 11 either. So declaration number 11 of the Lisbon Treaty is saying that the President of the European Council and the European Parliament have to set up a mechanism to consult on which name to be proposed for Commission President by the European Council. So that's something that should happen between the European elections, end of May, and the European Council making the proposal, end of June. And that can be something very important. Why can it be very important? It can be very important because it's a recognition, public recognition, that the outcome of the European elections matters already for the proposal, and that the different political forces in the European Parliament have to express themselves who of the potential candidates would also have a parliamentary majority. That's something very similar to what we know from different of our member states, where in fact you have a person that's consulting the different political forces about who has a majority behind him or her to form the executives. All of this is complemented by the willingness of European political parties to put forward lead candidates for Commission President. As of now, according to my information, except one of the European political parties, all have the intention to put forward lead candidates, probably to be known end of February, beginning of March next year. That means the person who should be leading the executive will not come as a surprise after the event, as a white rabbit out of the cylinder, but can be known to the electorate in advance. What is the effect on the elections? Probably limited the first time around, but if you think about not one, but 2 or 3 or 4 elections, it could become a major element in the choice to be made. The question then will also be, whoever then is the proposed candidate, will the Parliament just elect that person, or will there be a debate and negotiation about political content? Already last time around, President Barroso proposed to Parliament his own political program. That's something that could be further developed. Those who are skeptical about the system are saying, yes, but even if that president then reflects the outcome of the European elections, you will not have a situation like in our member states, where you then have a clear executive on the one side or the other. Absolutely right. It will be broadly spread and will probably resemble more to what we know in Switzerland under the name of Concordance Demokratie. I don't know the English expression, maybe it's Concordance Democracy, but something where the figurehead is clearly representing a political choice, but on the other side you have broad political support. This new situation has been reflected by the decision of the Bureau of Parliament for the information campaign which we are conducting in 2014, which is put under the heading, "This time is different." And what's different is the possibility to impact the choice of the President of the Executive. So this is unused potential 1. Unused potential 2, the electoral law. When you have a closer look at our electoral law, you find that it's surprisingly, the common elements are surprisingly underdeveloped. And I would just like to mention some basic points which have also been put forward by the Conference of Presidents and by a recent report in the Constitutional Affairs Committee. 1, we don't have yet common standards for nomination procedure in the member states. We have some countries where this is something following very strong procedures. We have other countries where basically a person at the head of the party decides. That's an area where we could clearly strengthen and further develop democratic process in this election. The second, when citizens are voting, they only find the name of the national party on the ballot paper. It's normal that they find the name of the national party, but we all know that those candidates, once elected to parliament, for the next 5 years, will work in political families. So I think it would be very important that also the name of the European political party is mentioned on the ballot paper. And the third thing, for the moment, no result can be published before closing of the last election in the last member state, which is 22 hours, among others in Italy. This has as a consequence that the European citizens as such do not have a common electoral evening. I'm tempted to say that Northern Europe has already gone to bed. Not everybody in Northern Europe, but many in Northern Europe will have gone to bed. So they will never have the possibility to experience, like you have during national elections, an election evening with the results coming in from the different electoral areas, colleges, and see how a political majority is forming in Europe. Those figures are only available the next day, and the next day people are back to work. Unused potential 3, scrutiny. About a year ago, I had a very interesting conversation with the outgoing US ambassador to the European Union, Bill Kennard, and he will surely allow me to mention this. He said when he's drawing his some conclusions from his stay and compares the US Congress to the European Parliament, he doesn't see the big difference in legislative powers. On the contrary, with some experience, we could argue that the legislative powers of the European Parliament are going much further and further into detail, because in the US system, a lot is delegated to regulatory agencies. So in fact, no longer available for Congress for decision making, unless you completely revoke the delegation of power. But he said he's surprised in comparison how little our own system in the European Union is developed on scrutiny. Because the US Congress has developed very sophisticated measures to hold the executive to account. This reflection we have deepened with a comparative study with 4 national parliaments and the US Congress, and in fact we have come to the conclusion that scrutiny is an area where we in the European Parliament need to improve. It can also be linked to the most recent developments, because if the Troika is active in a member state, who is holding them to account? The national parliament very often is in a very weak situation, because not accepting means basically bankruptcy. So their possibility to exercise that scrutiny is limited. The place where that scrutiny, though, could be exercised is the European Parliament. The same is true for banking supervision. The European Central Bank is now developing a second pillar and will become responsible for banking supervision in Europe. Banking supervision sounds very something very, nice and soft, but what does it mean? It means that as a result of that banking supervision, a bank might have to change its management, have to recapitalize, or is being closed. Those are decisions which are of major importance for citizens, for member states, and for the European Union as a whole. So the question is, who is going to scrutinize those decisions? In the agreement on banking supervision, there's also an agreement for an interinstitutional agreement between the European Parliament and the European Central Bank, which is currently being negotiated in order to establish that scrutiny on the European level. In February, I've been visiting the Government Accountability Office in the United States. The Government Accountability Office is the United States Court of Auditors. They have about 3,000 staff, but only with about 10% of their staff, they are doing what we traditionally understand to be the role of a Court of Auditors, which means to check the legality of payments. 90% of their staff is doing something else. 2/3 of their staff is actually working in close agreement with Congress on the basis of the jointly established working program on the question of legislative performance. So is the legislation passed really working or isn't it working? And are spending programs really working or aren't they working? And the big advantage of a Court of Auditors in this respect is that the Court of Auditors has the right to go down to the member state level and check whether legislation is working and whether spending programs are working. That means if we want to have efficient scrutiny on the European Union level, we also need a very close cooperation with the Court of Auditors. Thankfully, the European Court of Auditors is already shifting from a focus just on the legality of payments to what they call performance audits. More and more work of the Court of Auditors is in the area of performance audits. It is up to the Parliament to make better use of those performance audits and make them available before legislation is being reviewed and before spending programs are being reviewed, which means that those results should not only stimulate a debate in the Budgetary Control Committee, but in all the sectorial committees responsible as well. The last point I would like to mention is ex post impact assessment. It's very closely related to what I mentioned on the Government Accountability Office. If we want to have a look at the full legislative cycle, and if we know that increasingly Parliament is dealing with amending legislation instead of legislation where there has never been legislation, we need to be in a more systematic way interested in what has effectively been the impact of legislation once it did hit the ground. There's a lot of documentation already available, including from the European Commission, but it also needs to become more easily available for our members when they're doing their legislative work. 1 year ago, we established a new directorate on impact assessment, and one of those units is dealing with ex post impact assessment. The aim is, with very little staff, to systematically scrutinize what do we know about how legislation is working on the ground and make it available when that legislation is coming back to Parliament. Unused potential number 4. Unused potential number 4 is what I would call a parliamentary pillar or a parliamentary partnership. What does it mean? I believe that the relationship which we are currently enjoying both with the Committee of the Regions and with the Economic and Social Committee could be developed further. We are physical neighbors, but very tellingly, even though our buildings are bordering on each other, all the connections have been closed, even those which existed in the past. So the question is, wouldn't we profit from revitalizing that relationship? I believe that the Committee of the Region and the Economic and Social Committee could have a lot to offer. The Economic and Social Committee, in times of economic and social crisis, of debt crisis, should be a prime source of expertise on those matters which could be used in parliamentary work. The Committee of the Regions has the big advantage that it's based on members coming from local and regional authorities which have a lot of expertise exactly on the question I mentioned before, which is how does legislation actually work once it's hitting the ground, or how doesn't it work? So I believe we need to enter into a dialogue. How can we better cooperate and profit from this experience? We need a strong administrative and political partnership that's using our mutual expertise to the utmost. Equally, the relationship with national parliaments is on the agenda. We are no longer in a situation where this should basically be about information exchange, but both national parliaments and the European Parliament are decision makers. National parliaments have to hold their own governments to account. They have to monitor more closely what is happening in Council, whereas the European Parliament is responsible for decisions that are taken on the European level by the European institutions as such. We need to strengthen our expert-to-expert relationship of members in committee, and I believe that in national parliaments there is still a lot of potential to learn from how the other national parliament is organizing the control of the executive. Unused potential number 5, expertise. We are living in a situation where resources will become more and more scarce. European institutions still have a small nominal growth, but which is about 2% below our local inflation. That means, to be precise, our inflation in Brussels and Luxembourg of contracts and of staff costs is between 3 and 4%, so our cost is rising every year between 3 and 4, but the budget increases are between 1 and 2. That means de facto we have a loss of about 2%. So if we don't do anything about it, it means that our level of activity will have to shrink. And in fact, our staffing level will have to shrink over the next years by 5%. The question is therefore, will we become stale? Will we just continue to do what we have been doing but on a slightly lower level? Or are we still able to innovate and change and do new things? It's my firm belief that it's absolutely essential that we are critical about the things we have always been doing in order to be able to do new things. We have to focus our activities on our core business, and our core business is politics and legislation. We've therefore introduced also in the European Parliament a very strong monitoring with the aim to find efficiency gains. We will introduce a system over a number of years of cost accounting, a new financial management system based on SAP. I've established a unit for cost and quality control, and we have in the past 2 years identified a number of potential efficiency gains, especially in the language sectors. We have moved already in 2009, 2010, more than 60 lawyer linguists from the lawyer linguist service to the committees. In the past 2 years, we have identified more than 100 posts in translation and in interpretation which were emptied, and moved them to political support, among others to create a new directorate for impact assessment, to staff the House of European History without additional cost, to strengthen our own core functions. We have saved in the last year in the area of interpretation 15 million euros additionally by better organizing our committee meetings, which can no longer all take place on Tuesday, Wednesday, which means our own resources were underused on Monday, Thursday, but committees have to meet Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, Thursday. We are not doing night sessions anymore in Strasbourg because it meant that interpreters were not allowed to work the next day for social protection reasons. And we are doing our delegations in so-called turquoise weeks so that our own resources are fully available in committee weeks. Maybe this sounds like boring administrative staff, but it creates savings every year of 15 million euros. Those 15 million euros we can use much better. We've stopped translating the compte rendu in extenso of the plenary sessions in all the languages. Annual savings, every year repeatable, 8.4 million euro. Why are we doing this? We are doing this to be able to finance new things. We are doing this in order to still be able to innovate. In this sense, and in order to increase our expertise, the Bureau of Parliament has decided in its, not the last session, but the session before, to create a parliamentary research service. We will establish at the beginning of next year a parliamentary research service on the basis of existing resources from the current library and the Directorate for Impact Assessment, with about 200 staff, with the aim to provide our individual members with their own independent scientific advice. This is a service which has the vocation to grow, but only through internal redeployment of resources. Unused potential number 6, programming. I asked the question, who knows declaration number 11? I could also ask the question, who knows the phrase on programming in Article 17 of the Lisbon Treaty? Christian will know it again. But nobody knows it, and the Commission doesn't want to know it. So how does it read? It reads, the European Commission initiates the annual and multi-annual programming of the Union. So far the Commission remembers. But then the sentence continues, in view to reach interinstitutional agreement. So it's not just that the Commission is invited to initiate legislation. No, the story is more complete. In view to reach interinstitutional agreement. So this means that we should have a consultative process which should involve the two lawmakers, the Council and the Parliament, to agree on the annual and the multi-annual legislative program. The Bureau has decided in its, again, about 6 weeks ago, to authorize a restructuring of DG Presidency, which I had proposed, which is now giving a special responsibility to the Deputy Secretary General to be active in this area. I've been told I'm speaking too long. I agree. So I will cut it a bit short, but I still would like to mention unused potential number 7, and then I will stop and be open for questions. Unused potential number 7, European political parties. European political parties have developed in the past years, also thanks to better financing and therefore organization, from basic program organizations to policy coordination. What do I mean with policy coordination? They organize meetings where representatives of the same party from the Commission, from the Council, from the Parliament come together during a legislative procedure and try to, let's say, have closer views on an issue. That is policy coordination. That's something which has not really been publicly perceived as being like this. I know that at least one of them is doing this for 11 different councils of ministers. So that's a reality which also deserves to be seen. So you know now that I don't like the expression democratic deficit, that I'm convinced there are many elements of democratic surplus. Nevertheless, there's a huge and wide area where we could all improve. We don't have to wait for treaty change. We can start right now and address the concerns of the citizens and increase the legitimacy of the system in times where the European Union is taking more and more decisions which have direct and important consequences on their daily lives. Thank you very much.